Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another edition of Seekers of Meaning, the podcast of Jewish Sacred Aging. I'm your host, Rabbi Richard Address, and I greatly appreciate you being with us. These podcasts are designed to explore some of the issues that touch us, our families, in light of the revolution in longevity that is reshaping our Jewish world. And we appreciate your support. And you can follow us and listen to previous podcasts by going to our website, jewishsacredaging.com, as well as the Jewish Sacred Aging Facebook page. And we thank you always for your donations, which help further our work. And it's with great pleasure that we welcome to today's edition of Seekers of Meaning, Dr. Ari Kelman, the Jim Joseph Professor of Education and Jewish Studies at Stanford University. And for our purposes on Seekers of Meaning today, the co-author or co-editor of a brand new book, a recently published book, Beyond Jewish Identity, your co-author, Jon Levinsohn. Dr. Kelman, Ari, welcome to Seekers of Meaning. Thank you for being with us and joining us from a beautiful part of the country in the Bay Area of Northern California. Thank you. How are you doing today?
Thanks. I'm doing okay. It's great to be here. I appreciate the introduction.
Good. We have lots to talk about. This is a very, very fascinating book and very timely, given the changes that are taking place within the Jewish community in America. Beyond Jewish Identity, recently published, available, I'm sure, from the great God Amazon, and hopefully in as many bookstores as possible. It's a series of essays that examine from a variety of different perspectives, I guess to reduce it to New Jerseyan, what it means to identify as a Jew, and some of the challenges that are laid out moving forward into the 21st century. And you begin this book in a very interesting first sentence, the very first sentence in the page VII, that the book was motivated by a deep discomfort. Was that something you ate, or what was the discomfort? What was the motivation of this deep discomfort?
The discomfort was the sense, and for me, so I'm going to speak for me, not for my co-editor, Jon, but for me, it was born out of my research in the American Jewish community and the sense that the sort of drumbeat of Jewish identity as an outcome for Jewish education, as the desired outcome, and in some cases the only meaningful one, was one that had kind of run its course, I think. It was no longer an issue. I remember I was doing research. I was in another city and I was interviewing people in their 20s and 30s. And I was driving across the city after having done an interview with somebody. And I called my parents and I was sort of chit-chatting with them on the phone. And they were like, well, what are you learning while you're out there? I said, well, I think my main takeaway is that the Jewish identity argument is over and done with. Like, it's just not useful anymore. And that grew out of, it sort of crystallized in a conversation I had with somebody who I was interviewing, and I don't remember the details of the conversation, but they were somebody who was not involved in any way, shape, or form with the Jewish community in the city. You know, I said, would it be great if the city had a Jewish film festival? And they said, oh, that would be amazing. I would totally go. But as it happened, the city had a Jewish film festival already for some time. And nevertheless, they told me I have a strong Jewish identity, and told me all these ways in which they express that. And so this disjunct between the ability of this person and many other people that I spoke with to have a strong Jewish identity, and then to remain so independent of community structures, it struck me that the Jewish identity work that had begun mostly in the 1960s had succeeded. Jewish identity is strong among Jewish Americans, but that it didn't sort of really move the needle in any meaningful way. And so it struck me in a conversation that I had with Jon, that we should probably this was an impression that I had. It wasn't a conclusion. It wasn't based on like a systematic analysis of the data, but it was, it caught Jon's ear. And so we decided to try to deepen our analysis of the issue at hand.
So in the essay that you wrote, and I really want to focus on that a little bit, because I think it really is a very, very powerful essay, and hopefully will find its way into schools of education. The title of the essay, Identity in Crisis, the Origins of Identity as an Educational Outcome, And then you write in the beginning of the essay, regardless of movement affinity or educational program, identity is ubiquitous. And then there then follows, Ari, what seems to be the thesis statement. Presenting identity as an educational outcome assumes that it is possible to teach someone to have an identity. My generation, we came up with you go to religious school, you get bar mitzvah, you go to confirmation, you go to Jewish camp, and you have a strong Jewish identity. But that's not what I'm hearing from what you're writing.
Well, no, I think actually what I wrote. I grew up in a generation that operated under similar theories. I think, but my question was really with how was it that this idea that you could send somebody to a school or to a camp, and that school or that camp that the meaningful outcome of that school or camp experience would be a stronger Jewish identity or a Jewish identity, full stop, strong, weak, or otherwise. And it didn't make sense to me that this was an educational outcome. And the more time I spent in circles of scholars who study education, public school education, moral education, race, equality, and so on, this was very strange to me. And the more time I thought about it, the stranger it got. That is, how is it that schools or camps teach people to have Jewish identities? What does that look like? What are the mechanisms by which that happens? I could tell you how to teach students to add fractions. I could tell you, I have scholars who study how to teach students to analyze historical documents, do science experiments, run a mile slightly more quickly than they had before. There are techniques for doing that. There are skills and strategies tested, practiced. I still don't know what the analogous set of skills, practices, dispositions might be to foster or cultivate a strong Jewish identity in a student.
Is it more relationships than academics? Is it the friends that I make? Is it the crowd I hang out with in high school, or the 2 or 3 people I may meet in college, or is it that? Is it that?
Well, I think
Go ahead.
For me, rather than looking for the precise mechanisms by which that happens, because I don't know what it is. Sociologists would call all of those things just socialization in general, but not necessarily education. But I think for me, the bigger issue is not to look for a different set of mechanisms by which such a thing happens, but to really investigate and sort of interrogate the very idea that identity was supposed to be the main outcome of education.
So we have all these religious schools. If it's not the main, what's the function? What do you see the function? Or as you seem to allude to in the essay, and you'll tell me if I've totally misread that. It seems to be almost not an indictment. That may be the wrong word, but a severe questioning of the efficacy of the suburban supplemental religious school, Wednesday afternoon Hebrew school, Sunday morning or Shabbat morning, and that's how I get my Jewish education. Did I misread that? It's sort of like an implicit indictment of that as a successful means of creating identity?
That wasn't my intention. My intention in that essay, because I don't actually draw on any analyses of suburban supplementary schools in that essay. What I draw on in that essay is really going back to the period. I tried to locate and fix in time the period in which people started talking about identity as a Jewish educational outcome. And the essay, I think, that precedes it in the volume, maybe comes right after it, Jonathan Krasner's essay, he really looks at how it is that the Jewish community started talking about identity. And he traces the development of what he calls the Jewish identity.
The Jewish identity industrial
complex. The Jewish industrial complex.
Yes,
right.
it's great. I underlined that. I wanted to ask you about that. You jumped right to it. Could you define that for me? The Jewish identity industrial complex. We don't have any fighter planes.
It's clearly no. I mean, it's clearly a reference to the military industrial complex.
Yeah.
But it's the complex of things: camps, synagogues, philanthropic endeavors, museums, you name it, restaurants, community celebrations, social justice activities, all of which kind of revolve around or seem to coalesce or move toward a sense that Jewish identity is a valuable outcome or product. And so I decided to sort of narrow the focus that Jonathan developed in his essay to look more specifically at when it was that identity and education became so closely aligned. So it wasn't really, I mean, if it is an indictment of Sunday schools, that was a byproduct, because I wasn't looking at Sunday school specifically in that essay.
But do you think, your personal opinion, you've studied this, you teach all this at Stanford, you've analyzed it, you've written now about it, that old debate between the day school and a real intense education to build that identity, or the typical suburban synagogue religious school?
I think my opinion, I'm always in danger when I'm asked my opinion. I'm much more comfortable talking about the data. They serve different functions in the community. They're really different animals. They're not, Sunday school is not a bad version of day school. It's a version of Sunday school or religious school, supplementary school. They attract families for different reasons. They're supported by different institutions for different reasons. They deploy different pedagogical methods, different curricula, and so on. So for me, it's not really a debate as much. And again, this is not based on systematic analyses of actual families making actual decisions. So it's really hard for me to say. But I think structurally they're just different things. They serve different purposes for the families and for the institutions around them.
The life cycle thing, so many congregations hang Jewish identity around the preparation for the bar and bat mitzvah, and so many religious school curriculum are geared just to, as I sometimes say, teach to the test, to teach to the performance of this ritual. Does the larger sense of what it means to be a functioning Jew in the 21st century in America get lost because we're just paying too much attention for 3 or 4 years to just what are you going to do on that Shabbat morning at the synagogue?
I don't know what it means to be a functioning Jew in America, so I'll take that. That is, does being a bar mitzvah make you a functional Jew in America? I don't know. I don't know that that's the case. I don't know that you need it to be a functioning Jew in America. I don't know what it means to be a functional Jew in America. I do have a sense that sort of teaching to the test of Hebrew schools, and this I do have some research on, doesn't actually get in the way of the families really enjoying the ritual. B'nai Mitzvah are extremely meaningful, at least to the families that I interviewed for a project that we're working on. And they don't have any misgivings about it. They may have some misgivings, but it doesn't compromise the fact that their family's celebration of that event is something they take really seriously, something that they celebrate, and something that was for them really meaningful as they are growing up to be American Jews, or the kids are growing up to be American Jews.
Ari, do you think that this change that we're seeing right now because of the pandemic and this explosion of online learning, education, services, worship, all virtual, Zoom, whatever. And this just occurred to me as you're talking, and because we're doing so much of it all over the world, really. But do you think that has an impact, or could have an impact upon one's Jewish identity? Because I can access more things Jewishly that I never perhaps was able to before, and could broaden my horizons and open up new possibilities of learning and understanding? Or do you think it's just a temporary phenomenon?
I think the impact of this situation is not temporary. The situation might be temporary. The impact is going to be felt for a very, very long time. I don't think that identity is really where we ought to be looking or thinking. I don't think it's particularly productive. I think there's all kinds of other ways we might consider describing or referring to how people live their Jewish lives, but I don't think identity is really a terribly useful term. We looked at, if we want to take the Pew 2013 report as one example, where they say that one, and I like the Pew Report a lot. They say one of the things is to describe American Jewish identity, but which they kind of do. But the keyword there isn't Jewish identity. The keyword there is describe. That is, Jewish identity isn't a finding of the Pew Report. Jewish identity is a criterion for participation. So 100% of participants in the Pew Report have a Jewish identity. It's how you get into the survey. If you don't have a Jewish identity, you don't get to participate. And so for me, if 100% of the people have a certain character, share a certain characteristic, analytically, it's not that interesting to me. We can talk about what they do religiously. We can talk about their ethnic or racial identities that they share as well, or their ethnic or racial affiliations. We can talk about socioeconomic status. We can talk about gender. We can talk about all kinds of things, family structure, you name it. But to reduce all of the things to a measure of a single thing called Jewish identity, I think is, again, is going to, it'll lead us into chasing our tails.
What's in your research? How would you describe, if you were designing the perfect system, I guess, how would you enter this conversation? I mean, you want to, the essay says, that you're talking about identity and crisis, but what do you think if you could just bring all the Jewish leaders together in a room, give them a cup of coffee, perhaps a rugelach, and say, this is how you should really handle this. This is how to approach this situation, this question. What would you say?
So, well, I'd say two things. First is I'm the wrong person to convene that meeting. I'm not much of a prescriptor of things, and I have great respect for people who are. This morning, I sat through my kids' Jewish day school moving up ceremony, which is the sort of end of the year ritual that acknowledges this kids moving from second grade to third grade and so on.
Right.
And the professional staff, thank you. The professional staff of that school is they're amazing. They're totally amazing, and I can't do what they do, and I don't do what they do, and I can inform them with information about how they might do what they do better. But I really leave it to the experts in those areas to be experts in those areas in the way that I'm an expert in my area, and we have common cause and we have things to talk about between us. But for me to sort of, just like belly up to the bar in a conversation that I'm not really part of seems sort of chutzpahdik to me, and not in a good way. So I actually don't like being asked to make recommendations like that because I'm just not the person to do it. There's people out there who are really good at it. The second thing I would say, so first is I would say I'm in the wrong place. The second thing though I would say is if I'm going to help this conversation along, anytime we use, I would suggest to everybody that anytime we use the phrase Jewish education or Jewish identity, we should pause and think about with greater precision and depth what it is that we are using Jewish identity to refer to. What is the cluster of concerns? What is the set of issues? What are the list of criteria that we mean when we say Jewish identity? And with that, hopefully it would encourage people to broaden the conversation around this thing that people have really fixed as the desired outcome of Jewish education.
You make the statement in the middle of your essay that to strengthen Jewish identity, quote, you call for a, quote, greater investment in Jewish education, unquote. Investment of money, human resources.
Wait, I say we should strengthen.
Yes.
What page is that? Sorry. I just want to call it up because it doesn't sound like something I've written.
Let's see here. I don't know whether you can bring that up on page 80.
Sorry, I'm looking for it.
Yeah, I have to find.
Okay, which paragraph is that?
I wrote it down and I didn't mark it. But when you talk about a greater investment, and I just wanted to find out what you meant by investment of what.
My hunch. That is not me talking. That is me. Well, it is me talking, but it's me describing the responses of a set of Jewish community leaders in the early 1970s. That is, they perceived a weakness in Jewish identity, what they saw as Jewish identity, right. And they saw the response, right? So it's not me saying we should have greater investment. That's me saying they thought we should have greater investment.
Right. Yes.
So, so what did I mean by investment? It was kind of bulking up of the educational apparatus in American Jewish life, day schools and so on. As it happens, it coincided with the rise in Jewish day schools in the early 1970s, but
Right.
that they needed to invest more deeply in Hillel in particular, but also in day schools and supplementary schools and so on, camps.
Are the research that you've done with young Jews coming into college, I seem to get the sense from the essay that they're really not prepared, Jewish educationally, to deal with some of the challenges they'll see when they get to college. I know in the classes that I've taught in the last several years to high school seniors who are about to go to college, they seem generally concerned of how they're going to deal with the BDS thing, the pro-Palestinian thing, or being confronted by somebody in their dorm room to really be challenged on issues of religion. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. So to be clear about one thing, the essay in the book is a historical essay. It talks about Jewish community leaders, and it draws on sources from the late 1960s and early 1970s. And what's interesting to me about your question is that those folks were writing and thinking about exactly the same thing that you are asking about today, which is, are Jewish kids coming out of high school sort of adequately prepared, whatever adequately prepared means, to handle the pressures of being a Jewish kid on a college campus today? So what's interesting to me is we're asking the same questions that we were a generation ago, more than a generation ago, maybe 2 generations ago. I mean, I think in the essay I quote Yitz Greenberg, who calls it a wasteland or something, calls college campuses a wasteland for Jewish identity. And so it's interesting that we're asking these same questions, which suggests that perhaps we're not asking the right questions, because the situation on college campuses now is different than it was 2 generations ago. And I'm not totally sure that the reporting on the situation then as now was accurate.
So they, in some of the other essays, and again, we don't have time to go through all the essays, but the Meta essay on multiple identities really, I think, speaks to a lot of what the community is now is dealing with. The total change in the family structure. I know when we ran the Department of Jewish Family Concerns for the Union and did a lot of studies on the changing nature of the Jewish family, we go out to congregations and say, there is no such thing as a typical Jewish family in anymore. We come in all shapes, sizes, preferences, etc. And the Meta essay talks about religious and community institutions having to decide if they are interested in fostering hybrid Jewish identities. This really speaks to the change that I would assume that you're finding in your research. And what's the implication, really, as we move forward into the future, in your opinion?
So I think one of the implications of the Meta essay, and I think it's really, I mean, this book took a little while to get out, but actually I love all the essays in it. The question is, I think it is fundamental for the American Jewish community. That is, for the bulk of the 20th century, I can say, and probably back to the 19th and maybe the 18th century, the American Jewish community was a community that was structured around and for Jews, and Jews exclusively. And that was partially owing to anti-Semitism. It was partially owing to kind of nascent sense of some kind of collectivity that was exclusive in some way. And I think in the latter part of the 20th century and into the 21st, we are seeing Jewish communities that are not comprised solely of Jews. We're seeing, and in the 21st century, certainly, we're seeing a Jewish community that is not comprised solely of Ashkenazi Jews, Jewish identified people that are not solely of Ashkenazi origin. And we are seeing the need to create Jewish communities in which diversity is a central feature. And I mean diversities of all kinds. And that is a fundamental challenge for schools for Jewish day schools that trade in having exclusively Jewish students in them. It's a challenge for camps. It's a challenge for federations and social service organizations. It's a challenge for the denominations or the movements. It's a challenge for the rabbis and the educators who are kind of on the front lines of doing the community building work. Because we can no longer operate under the assumption that the Jewish community has only Jews in it. And that is I think that while people acknowledge that, I don't think that the leadership of the American Jewish community has really and fully, truly grappled with that fact.
Does that include the now established reality of interfaith marriages and the interfaith families that are in our congregations and sending their kids to the camps and schools?
Yeah,
I mean, obviously,
of course.
your research, obviously you're probably in your classes that you teach. I would assume that this, and the students who sit in your classes probably reflect that as well.
Yeah, I mean,
the
I don't
whole
ask my
interfaith,
students.
the whole interfaith thing.
Sometimes they share of their own volition about their own backgrounds, but I don't ask them their backgrounds. That's not my job. But yeah, I think that issue is central, and in any family, in any synagogue, particularly Reform conservative, maybe Reconstructionist synagogues, some significant proportion of those families have non-Jews in them, and some proportion of that community is supported in significant measure by the non-Jewish members of those Jewish families and the non-Jewish members of those Jewish communities. And so we can't pretend that there's some sort of exclusive Jewishness that exists in these communities, and that they're not sort of fellow travelers,
right,
in Jewish communities. They're full participants, central actors in those communities.
I got to ask you before we start running out of time, that because the Maggid essay talks about Israel, and I was raised from remembering in HUC and the 6-Day War and the Yom Kippur War and the whole shift in the way we viewed Israel. And I'm sure your studies, and I imagine it comes up in class. What do you see now, the role of Israel, given everything that's happening there, and the formation of identity within the American Jewish community? Is it as central? Is it waning? Is it changing? Is it generationally different? How do you see this?
We should have a different podcast, maybe. That's a real big question, to talk about that if you really want to. It's massive. It's both waning and it's more central. It may be more central among a smaller group, but it very often dominates community conversations. It is complicated for Jewish students on campus. I can say that because they're the only group. Well, not the only group, but they're the group I've studied the most extensively. Mm-hmm. But I just wrote an article with a colleague, Ilan Baron, that was published earlier this year about a synagogue. We studied the synagogue and why the synagogue couldn't talk about Israel. And we found that basically the participants in the study in this synagogue, which is kind of a typical suburban synagogue, they generally loved Israel. They generally felt supportive of Israel. They were conscious of and scared by the fact that talking seriously about Israel would disrupt their local community, and they were really committed primarily in a sort of fundamental way to their local community. This was their synagogue. They were worried about budgets. They were worried about the education program. They were worried about losing members. They were worried about trying to bring more members in. And basically they made a kind of calculated decision, most of them, to not talk about Israel, not because they don't care about it, or not for any other reason other than the potential cost of that seemed to them to be a bit too high, and their basic commitment was to their own congregation. That is, the local commitment outweighed the kind of more ephemeral sense of valuing the state of Israel. And so that I think is interesting. It's not just that people are quote unquote scared to talk about Israel, which is already a story that American Jews tell about themselves. But the ways in which they balance out or sort of weigh against each other, their different values, their different commitments, their different senses of what's important now and otherwise, is part of why it's hard to talk about Israel. It's not just that people disagree politically.
So you mentioned
and students are not that dissimilar.
Students are not that dissimilar, did you say? Correct?
That's right. Correct.
Yes.
They're also weighing the local costs of engaging in that fight. And for many of them, in a report that we wrote a couple of years ago, for many of them, that fight isn't the fight about Israel and Palestine is not their fight. They feel like.
You alluded to just before in your answer that the people are in the congregation that you studied very passionately identified with their local community. And my belief is that just as all politics are local, all religion is local. And how important in your perception of the structure of what it means to identify as a Jew or Jewish identity, how important is the local synagogue? How important is that synagogue to what you're researching and what you're talking about?
I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, I haven't done that research, so I don't know how I can't generalize about anything. I can't even generalize about that one community. We went through the synagogue because the synagogue was the place where that conversation about Israel wasn't happening, and so I wanted to find out what wasn't being talked about. But in terms of generalizing how important synagogues are, it's hard to say. Certainly, they're going to. Well, no, I can't say anything with certainty, so I take that back. Before I open my mouth and put my foot into it.
No. Just your impression. I mean, you've studied identity. You teach it. You're aware of what's happening in the community around and around the country with this restructuring of many different things. From your sense, from a person who's analyzing and studying the data and the shift and changes sometimes in community, does the synagogue still have that central, in your opinion, that central role in who we are as a community? Or is the synagogue importance of that synagogue lessening? Your just gut reaction.
My gut reaction is to deflect the question. I really, I can't. I mean, I can't say. I can't generalize, and I don't know. It's going to continue to be important to people for whom it's important. It may change. The synagogue structures may change in the wake of social distancing and COVID-19. New synagogues will undoubtedly emerge, whether they're called synagogues or not, whether they're called sacred communities or spiritual communities or something else. The need for community will never go away. Where that community takes place and how it takes place and what it does when it convenes will likely continue to evolve, just like the synagogue has evolved historically, right? What we observe as synagogues now is, buildings, occasionally campuses, wasn't what they were 100 years ago, wasn't what they were 50 years ago, wasn't what they were 500 years ago. So that thing will continue, and its role in the lives of its members will also continue to evolve. That's about all I can say with any certainty.
Oh, that's pretty cool. So thank you. Dr. Ari Kelman, the Jim Joseph Professor of Education and Jewish Studies at Stanford University and co-editor of a very, very interesting new book, recently published book, which if we have colleagues who perhaps listen to this particular podcast, I would urge you to put that on the list. So definitely adult education and sermonic material here, no question about it. The book is called Beyond Jewish Identity, again on Amazon and hopefully in your local bookstore. But I know definitely if you go to the Great God Amazon, it'll be there in a heartbeat. So Ari, thank you very much. I appreciate your time and your honesty, and just continued good luck. Good luck with those kids. Mazel tov on the move up. First of many.
Thanks for my address. I appreciate it.
Start saving your money for when they move up to college. It's a whole different ballgame. It's a different type of move up. Trust me on that one. But thank you, and say hello to your family for me. Take care.
Thanks so much. I will. Take care.
Take care. To all of you, again, thank you for listening to this edition of Seekers of Meaning, the podcast of Jewish Sacred Aging. And a reminder that you can follow us on the website, jewishsacredaging.com, as well as the Facebook page, Jewish Sacred Aging on Facebook. And again, we appreciate your donations to help further the work of Jewish Sacred Aging. You can go to the website and click on the icon that says donate. And for any questions or concerns or comments, just email me at rabbiaddress@jewishsacredaging.com. These podcasts are recorded at the studios of Lubetkin Global Media in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and we thank our producer, the amazing Steve Lubetkin. Again, thank you for being with us. We look forward to greeting you on our next Seekers of Meaning, the podcast of Jewish Sacred Aging. Todah and Shalom.